Sharp words for the US from Canada's incoming Prime Minister. Mark Carney has lashed out at Donald Trump, saying his country will never be part of the United States. As the standoff between the two nations intensifies, how will Carney deal with Trump? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm James Bays. Mark Carney, Canada's incoming Prime Minister, says he will confront head-on the challenge his country is facing from its powerful neighbour. US President Donald Trump has imposed tariffs on nearly all goods coming from Canada. Carney has promised to push back with trade taxes of his own and is seeking to unite Canadians against this challenge from America. With elections on the horizon, how will this play out politically? And can Canada's close relationship with the US survive this turmoil? We'll go to our panel in just a few moments, but first this report from Fintan Monaghan.
Mark Carney!
Mark Carney is Canada's new Prime Minister-designate. There's an election on the horizon, but his Liberal Party is only a few points behind its Conservative rivals.
Bonjour tout le monde.
As a former central bank chief, supporters say he's the right man to lead Canada as it faces an economic showdown with the United States.
The Americans want our resources, our water, our land, our country. Think about it. If they succeeded, they would destroy our way of life.
US President Donald Trump wants to impose a 25% tariff on nearly all goods from Canada. Some of the levies have already been implemented, others postponed to early April. Mexico and China are also facing tough measures. Trump has complained about what he says are unfair trade taxes on US goods. And he wants the three countries to do more to stem the flow of illegal drugs and undocumented migrants to the US. President Trump has promised all trading partners that impose tariffs will face reciprocal measures.
It's going to be very costly for people to take advantage of this country. They can't come in and steal our money and steal our jobs and take our factories and take our businesses and expect not to be punished. And they're being punished by tariffs.
Canada has long been one of America's closest allies and trade partners. In 2024, it bought more US exports than any other country, around $350 billion worth. It was also the third largest supplier of goods to the US, at around $412 billion. The two countries are both part of the NATO alliance, the G7, and the Five Eyes intelligence sharing network. But all this appears to count for little with President Trump. It's not clear how long this trade war will last, or what a deal might look like. But once the dust settles, it may prove difficult for relations between the US and Canada to return to business as usual. Fintan Monaghan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's discuss all of this further with today's guests. And from the Canadian city of Cambridge in Ontario, we're joined by Jen Hassum. She's the Executive Director of the Broadbent Institute, a progressive think tank. In Washington, D.C., Amy Koch, a Republican strategist who served as Majority Leader of the Minnesota Senate. And in St. Augustine in Florida, John Kirton, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Toronto and founder of the G7 and G20 research groups. Thank you, all of you, for joining us on Inside Story today. Let me start with you, Jen. We have two Canadians on the panel, but only one currently in Canada. The 24th President of Canada is going to be Mark Carney. If I told you that last year, would it have surprised you? There was a poll in July last year in which Canadians were shown Carney's picture. 93% had no idea who he was.
That's right. And there has been a lot of shakeups in the Canadian political scene. Justin Trudeau resigning abruptly in January. I don't think Canadians would have predicted that, nor I don't think we would have predicted the rise of Mark Carney and the return of the Liberal Party. I think most Canadians would have thought that Pierre Poilievre was going to be a shoo-in to be our next prime minister during the next election, which needs to happen sometime between now and October. But with the resignation of Justin Trudeau, Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England, has been elected the new Liberal leader, and he is very much neck and neck with Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives.
John, you're our political analyst. He becomes the Prime Minister. That is definite. But does he stay the Prime Minister? Because there are elections have to be held, I believe, by October the 20th. But many believe there's going to be a snap election. Is that what you think is likely, John?
I think it's highly likely that Mark Carney, within the coming days, will go to the Governor General, King Charles' representative here, the sovereign, and say, dissolve the House of Commons, call a general election. I need a mandate from the Canadian people to confront Donald Trump, to win the tariff war, and indeed to do all the other things I need to keep Canadians safe, secure, and prosperous. And the polls, on the whole, they show the two parties, the opposition Conservatives led by Pierre Poilievre and the Liberals now led by Mark Carney, are neck and neck. But the leading poll that has proved to be the most accurate one shows there's a very good chance that in a general election, Mark Carney will secure a majority government and have it by the time he hosts the G7 summit in Kananaskis in Alberta, Canada, on June 15th.
And that is going to be quite a date. We'll come back to that in a moment, John. But just to be clear, because not all our viewers around the world will understand how the system works in Canada, you have a parliamentary system, but you now have a Prime Minister who is not a member of Parliament. Do we assume he's going to try and find a seat during this election?
That's one choice he has, is to call a by-election and to win the seat, but that would take too long. Certainly in a general election, which he could start in a couple of days, he will run in a seat. Very likely, it is said, in one of the safe Liberal seats. That's in downtown Toronto, the biggest city in Canada. And there are now suddenly more safe Liberal seats. So he's got a choice. I don't think he'll pick one in Alberta, highly unfavorable to the Liberal Party for decades. And now, even though Mark Carney himself was raised in Alberta, if he becomes the Prime Minister, he'd be the first Prime Minister from Alberta out west in some time.
Amy, of course, the backdrop of all of this is the really bad relations. You could never have predicted they'd be like this between the US and Canada. Donald Trump says he's putting these tariffs on Canada, but it goes further than that. He's been goading the country and says it should become the 51st state. Canada's always been a good neighbour. I mean, what do you make of Trump treating Canada in such a hostile way? Is this the way you treat an ally and a neighbour?
So what Donald Trump is doing, and you can see it very clearly, his strategy is to lock down and secure the Western Hemisphere. Whether his talks with Mexico, where he stopped, the illegal or where he slowed down fentanyl trade, with the tariffs with Canada and Mexico, Greenland talks, shutting down shutting the Chinese out of the Panama Canal, talks with Colombia. He's clearly putting in a demarcation to secure and to lock down dominance in our Western Hemisphere. That said, I think a far better way to secure that with our Canadian neighbors would be in a more friendly manner. That's tends to not be Trump's way, but I do think that there are those in his administration, particularly Secretary of State Marco Rubio, that will understand the need for actual, soft diplomacy. It is Trump's way. He goes very hard on the rhetoric, and then he comes back to cut a deal. And I expect that is ultimately what will happen here with Mark Carney.
Now, Amy, you are a senior, or were a senior Republican in your state of Minnesota. You say that's Trump's way, this hostile and some would say cruel language that he uses. Is he serious, Amy, do you think, about this idea of annexation?
I don't believe he's serious about annexation. I don't believe he's even serious about Greenland becoming a protectorate. I think that he's looking for trading partners ultimately. He is ultimately, while he can be a bully, he is ultimately transactional and wants to get a deal. And this is his way of getting a deal. And I can disagree with that. But I do agree geopolitically that strengthening America's hand in our own backyard, in our own hemisphere, is of utmost importance. And, knowing when to push hard and then when to back off, will be the question. Can he draw that balance before he does real harm, by the way, potentially to not just Canada's economic situation, but America's as well.
Jen, of course, we've had Trudeau in power for almost a decade, and it's been clear for some time that he was in the waning days of his time in power. In a democracy, after about a decade, people start to get tired of you. Do you think with Trump, some of this was about Trudeau? He sensed that he was weak. How much do you think it was a personal issue with Trudeau?
I don't think it was a personal issue with Trudeau. And in fact, you've seen President Trump say that it doesn't really matter which leader is in Canada, that this is a policy that he's looking to pursue when it comes to tariffs on Canada. But that being said, certainly Trump's challenge to Canada has been a hindrance for the Conservatives in Canada. I myself, I don't live in the major cities in Canada, and my own neighbors and my own friends and family who may have really looked upon Trump very favorably and worn their own MAGA hats and had their own, Trump flags even on their homes, now don't look towards Trump as friendly or something that they'd want to emulate in Canada. And so, to some degree, the rise of Mark Carney might not be because of a rehabilitated liberal brand in Canada or Mark Carney himself. But it might be the diminishment of Conservatives in Canada who have, in many cultural ways and even direct ways, adopted a sort of MAGA Republican, type and style of politics. And now Canadians who were in that camp are just having second thoughts because they're seeing that, especially working class people, they're seeing that their pocketbooks and their jobs could be affected by this chaos that Trump is bringing.
John, we know that Carney will be the Prime Minister in the coming days. We don't know, as I said earlier on, whether he's going to stay the Prime Minister. But let's just dig a little bit deeper into who Mark Carney is and why he has appeal at this moment. I mean, he's a former banker, a former central banker in the UK, the Bank of England, and also he ran the Bank of Canada, both at a time of political turmoil in Canada during the financial crisis in 2008, in the UK during that very big moment of turmoil in Brexit. Do you think he is suited for this time of crisis right now for Canada?
Very much so. And most recently, he had a very senior position in one of Canada's leading financial asset firms, Brookfield Asset Management, closely connected to the equivalent leaders, Jamie Dimon and others, in New York City. So he knows the economy cold from the public and private sector and the world of finance. And that's exactly the kind of expertise you need to win the tariff wars against Donald Trump and all the economic damage it's doing to the financial system with the New York Stock Exchanges and NASDAQ just plummeting again and again, down 900 points yesterday. He also, of course, is not Justin Trudeau, and that's the one thing everybody knew about him from the start. And I do think that with Justin Trudeau, for Donald Trump, it was a bit personal. Justin Trudeau was young, loved by everybody when he first appeared on the world stage, and believed in all the things Donald Trump would say were woke. Gender equality. He was a leader, Trudeau, at home and abroad, Indigenous peoples reconciliation, legalized marijuana, very strongly in favor of the LGBTQ plus community. Mark Carney is personally associated with none of those things. The one big issue facing citizens in the United States, Canada, the world, climate change. And Mark Carney was the one who led the private financial system to control climate change in their long-term business interests. So I think he's got a very strong constituency amongst his fellow G7 leaders, but among many citizens of the United States, those in Los Angeles with the wildfires, those on the outskirts of New York City, the Hamptons are burning now, and so many other places in the United States. He could well, by the time we get to the Kananaskis Summit, have more appeal to the real issues, dangers of the citizens of the United States than Donald Trump with his big, bold rhetoric does.
Okay. Jen, in terms of his background, I mean, he went to Harvard and Oxford. He is this bookish central banker. But has he shown just in the last couple of weeks perhaps another side? He perhaps is a sharper, slicker media performer than some had expected. And it seems he's prepared to go on the attack, attacking one man in particular.
Yes, indeed. He's done the media circuit in the United States and here in Canada, and he's performing better than I think a former governor of two national banks would have been expected to, and engaging with people one-on-one. But I would caution some of the confidence that people are having right now in this discussion, and just to, I guess, perhaps throw a wrench into the narrative, if the goal is to recapture some of these 2015 liberals who voted for Trudeau and for whom now have moved to the Conservative Party, I think Mark Carney does need to be aware of in this time where there is a surging populist right to leading with these kinds of international credentials, and instead focusing on the real material issues that Canadians are facing when it comes to jobs, housing, healthcare. These are the top issues that Canadians are concerned about. And, people might not necessarily find that him running Brookfield Asset Management or his time at Goldman Sachs would endear trust amongst the Canadian working class to him. So this is a balance that I think some of the Liberal strategists, I hope they take that into account when they're putting together Mark Carney's campaign. And let me also just say for your audience, this is exactly why Mark Carney is expected to call an election in the next 5 days, because a Canadian election is just 30 to 40 days long, and you only have that period. And so it will take time for Mark Carney's opponents from the Conservatives and the New Democrats to run contrast ads and redefine Mark Carney in a negative light to the Canadian population. They want to go now. The Liberals want to go now, as the Liberal Party has the highest polling they've had, public polling they've had since 2021. So that's the nature of why he would be calling an election right now at its height and before opposition parties can really make a case against them.
Amy, let me ask you about Mark Carney and the view from your side of the border. If he had very little name recognition just a few months ago in Canada, one assumes in the US not many people know who Mark Carney is yet, but they are going to find out, aren't they? I mean, in his comments, he's certainly been on the attack. He's about to enter an election campaign, and it seems the way he's running things so far, he thinks his main opponent is actually Donald Trump. Is that just going to make things worse?
Well, it's never panned out well for anybody that's gone head to head with Donald Trump in that way. And I also think it's interesting to hear, well, LA and Martha's Vineyard are going to know him and support him. That's not where Trump's power is derived. His power is derived from the Rust Belt. It's derived from the southern states. It's derived from Texas and Arizona, those on the border that are worried about immigration. It's derived in my neck of the woods with the farmers. And Carney would do very well to lean into his Alberta roots and less into Toronto. And by that, I mean, there is a path here. Jen alluded to this, that her MAGA cheering Canadian family and friends are now hesitant, right? Which I think is contributing to Carney's rise and the Conservative Party a bit fumbling. But Carney can fumble that completely by ignoring the populist movement that there is. There is real concern in Minnesota around the tariffs. We have hog farmers on the border of Canada that have farms both in Minnesota and in Canada. And they are deeply, deeply concerned about this impact across the state. Farmers who are traditionally Trump supporters that have deep concerns, leaning into that before touting his way and trying to recapture some sort of like other Trudeau-esque populism in New York and California would not be the best approach if you're going to take Donald Trump on head on.
And also, Amy, where you come from, Minnesota, there is a threat, I believe, to your electricity supplies that come from Canada.
We're a little less concerned about that. MISO, we're on a grid system that is designed to sort of absorb impacts from loss of power, say Manitoba Hydro or the like. And so with that distributed system, we're a bit less worried about electricity. But should the tariffs continue and the trade war continue, that could become an issue as well, along with oil and other tar sands oil and other imports from Canada.
Jen, I mean, if you look at the polls right now, he's not actually Carney ahead. He's still slightly behind. So tell us about the man he's up against in an election.
Sure. He's up against Pierre Poilievre, who is the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. And Pierre was enjoying tremendous momentum that in my generation, I don't think I've seen since Trudeau 2015. And that momentum was created through a populist wave. Pierre Poilievre is a career politician. He was elected at a young age to serve in Parliament. He's raised in Alberta and has very strong libertarian values. He, during the course of his leadership race, would pay, have signifiers with the trucker convoy that Canada experienced. And his main message to Canadians was on housing, inflation, cost of living, and taxes. So I think what we're seeing is that, for example, Pierre Poilievre's main plank was the removal of the carbon tax. And Mark Carney, one of the first things that he said in his leadership campaign was that he was going to remove the consumer carbon tax. So in some regards, we are seeing the rise of Carney, yes, at the same time as the Trump threats to Canada, but he's positioning himself to also mimic some of Pierre's leading popular ideas. Okay. And so those voters who are seeking those changes from Justin Trudeau
let me bring
are
in
more
John
likely
now
to vote for Carney.
And talk about the how this is going to be viewed by other allies, because Canada, of course, is a member of NATO, it's a member of the G7, and as you've already mentioned, John, the timing is remarkable. Canada is hosting the G7, and on June the 15th, it's supposed to have a summit of those leaders, including Trump. Do we even think Trump is going to attend?
Oh, I do indeed. He certainly did the last time Canada hosted the G7 summit. That was in Charleroi, Quebec in 2018. And Donald Trump will go because he loves to be the center of attention, both in the USA, it's in the same time zone, but around the world. And he also will want to tell his fellow leaders what they must do, thinking that they'll obey him. He's already just started to wage tariff wars not only against Canada, Mexico, China, but also against the European Union, and he's now threatening Japan. So all of the six G7 leaders will band together and say, Donald, we're all standing together against you. We're trading and will trade more amongst ourselves if you shut off the U.S. Markets to us.
Okay, Amy,
so
I
how
want to
far
bring in
do you
Amy
wanna-
quickly on this if I can. Amy, the following week after the G7, there's a NATO summit too. Of course, Canada is a NATO member. We have the situation with regard to Ukraine. Do you have worries that all of this is going to mean that the Western alliance that's existed since the end of World War II, 80 years ago, is collapsing?
I have no concerns about that. I think the Western Alliance is actually going through a needed sort of questioning, whether it's NATO and our European allies, not meeting their required 2%. So many of them have not, and which, by the way, 2% is a floor on their military spend, or where Minnesota, where the U.S. has decided we can't be always the only person sort of providing military support around the world. We need our allies to really be at the table to be allies. That is what America is looking for. I believe that's what Trump is pushing for. He does it in a way that I think is problematic, in that the balance can get simply out of whack, right? He can go too far, and striking that balance along with the G7, with NATO, across the world with all our allies is going to be very important. There's a point to where you can push people, and there's a point where you can push people too far, and you need to make sure to strike that proper balance. And so we'll see.
Thank you very much, Amy. Thank you to all of our guests today, Jen Hassum, Amy Koch, and John Kirton. We have teams reporting from both sides, Canada and the US. Stay tuned and find more coverage and analysis at aljazeera.com. We always want to hear from you with your comments and thoughts. Go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or find us on X. Look for @AJ Inside Story. I'll be back when the Inside Story spotlight moves to our next topic. Until then, from me, James Bays, and all the team here, please stay safe and healthy. Bye-bye.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.